Morning. This is your Stat Sensei, Mr. Sensei, and we're going to go over the first quiz. To receive extra credit, you're going to have to write everything down and listen to the entire episode. Okay, so here we go. The manager of a cultured pearl farm has received a special order for 7 pearls between 7 millimeters and 9 millimeters in diameter. From past experience, the manager knows that 43% of the oysters in his oyster beds contain pearls of the correct size. The manager wants to know how many oysters he should expect to open to find 7. Okay, so we're going to be looking for 7 pearls of the appropriate size for the special order. Describe how you would use a table of random digits to carry out a simulation to determine the number of oysters needed to find 7 pearls of the appropriate size. So this part of this question was worth 24 points. We had to find 7 pearls, and to do that, we had to give the assignments, etc. So I would assign as follows. Digits 0, 1 to 43 is oysters with the correct size, and that was because they said 43% of the pearls were of the correct size. Digits 44 to 99 and 00 are oysters with the wrong size. Now, this wasn't the only way to make the assignment. It did have to be a 2-digit number. Some groups used 00 to 42, and that was fine. And then they came back and they said, well, then there'd be 43 to 99, and that was acceptable. The main thing is we had to keep those percentages. There would be no skips, and repeats are permitted. Then it was I would work left to right, selecting 2-digit numbers until I had 7 numbers associated with oysters being the correct size. I would then count the number of oysters that I had to open and record. I would repeat this process multiple times and take the average. So here's the way this was scored. It was supposed to be 24 points. We actually ended up giving you 3, but the initial assignment was worth 3 points. That was worth 3. 44 to 99, those that were the wrong size were worth 3. No skips. And this was kind of tricky for people, but there really were no skips because we had oysters of the correct size and oysters of the wrong size, but we didn't have anything that wasn't an oyster. Everything is assigned, so we had no skips. Because we were working with percentages, repeats are permitted. So that's 4 things. Then working left to right, had to have that. That was worth 3 points. And when did we stop at trial? Well, we stopped once we got the 7 oysters. And then we needed to say that I would repeat the process and take the average. That was 7 things, which is 21 points. If you had all of those, you got the full 24 points. But essentially, that was 3 points apiece. Okay? So the next one, problem 2. Administrators at a hospital are concerned about the possibility of drug abuse by people who work there. They decide to check on the extent of the problem by having a random sample of employees undergo a drug test. Okay, I like the word random sample. Several plans for choosing the sample are proposed. Name the sampling strata and justify your response. So we had to name it and justify your response. So there are 4 classifications: doctors, medical staff, nurses, technicians, office staff, support staff, custodians. Randomly select 10 people from each category. So we know that we're broken into groups. So once we're broken into groups, this makes this a stratified sample process. And most people got those points. So naming it correctly, this is a stratified, that got you 2 points. But then we had to justify. How did we know that? And we know because we broke them into groups based on a single characteristic, which was their job classification. And then we randomly selected from each job classification. You had to have all of that. Say that we broke them into groups, then randomly selected from within. If you had all of that, that would be 4 points. 2 points for this, and then two points for identifying it correctly, and then 2 points for the justification to get your 4 points. The next one, each employee has an ID, 4-digit ID, randomly choose 40 numbers. Now, it didn't say this, but this is a random sample because, and everyone got this part, Every employee has been assigned a 4-digit number, and the numbers are randomly selected, which means all combinations of 40 employees have equal chance of being selected. We need to know it's not that each employee has the same, because that's true with all of these sampling types. It's that all combinations have an equal chance of being selected. So we had to have both of these in order to receive the 4 points. Then it says randomly select a department and test all the people who work in that department. So we're selecting a group. And by the way, anytime we're selecting groups, it's either going to be stratified or a cluster. So we're selecting a group. And so this is a cluster sample. And if you named it correctly, that was worth 2 points. And then you had to give why. The clusters are the departments, and every employee within the department will be tested, or a census will be conducted within the department. So once again, we had to have a definition justification, and we put that up on the board that a justification can often be a definition. So justification can often be a definition. At the start of each shift, choose every 10th person. Well, this is a systematic sample, and some people wrote systematic random sample. If you wrote that, that's correct, but really we're looking for systematic sample. But if you had systematic random sample, you received full credit from me. Because we are randomly selecting the first person to be tested. It could be number 4, number 6, number 7. The first person is randomly selected, and then we're selecting every nth person. Now, I was looking for nth, but if you said we're selecting every 10th person, that also received full credit. But once again, you had to have named it correctly, which almost everybody did. Some people missed this one. And then you had to say, hey, we're selecting every nth one after having randomly selected the first one. Moving on, number 3. Administrators at a hospital are concerned about the possibility of a drug abuse by people who work there. They decide to check on the extent of the problem by having a random sample of the employees undergo a drug test. Name and describe the kind of bias and give the outcome that might result if the administration decides that instead of subjecting people to random testing, they will just, in the case. So here we say interview employees about the drug abuse. All right, so with this, we have to say, hey, not only we're going to name what type of bias it is, which means we have to justify why it's that type of bias, but then we're also supposed to say what the outcome is. So we actually have 3 things that we have to address in this. All right, in order to get all 7 points. So interview employees about drug abuse. Well, that's a sensitive question. All right, so this is an example of response bias because it's a sensitive question. And when does response bias occurs? This is my justification. Response bias from being poorly worded or being sensitive in nature, causing the individual to give an inaccurate response, all right, or to lie. Now I need to put it in context and explain how this would be affected. In this case, the question is of a sensitive nature, and the employees that use drugs are likely to lie about their abuse of drugs. Okay, so we said they lie about their abuse of drugs. Okay, what will that overrepresent? Since we're talking about bias, we're either going to underrepresent something or overrepresent something. The consequence is that we will underestimate the number of employees who use drugs. All right. Or we'll overestimate the employees that don't use drugs. But you should have said something along those lines. So you needed to say, oh, we expect them to lie. This is an example of response bias because it's asking about drugs is a sensitive question. That would be the second thing. And the third thing is the consequence will either underestimate employees that use drugs or overestimate those that don't. So those, you had to have all 3 of those to receive all 7 points. Next, we could ask people to volunteer to be tested. We weren't trying to be tricky, but if it's volunteer, we're working at volunteer response bias, all right? In voluntary response bias, when the individuals are not randomly selected, we get to self-select as to whether or not they participate. Now, you didn't have to use the word self-select, but voluntary, when we did not select them. In this case, Those that do not use drugs are likely to get tested. Why? Because they're the ones they feel they're confident that they're not going to be found having used drugs and won't get in trouble. So in this case, those that do not abuse drugs are likely to get tested, while those that do abuse drugs are unlikely to get tested. So I had to say that, hey, we have people volunteering, they're self-selecting or something along those lines. And the consequence is that we will underestimate the number of employees that abuse drugs. So we'll overestimate those that don't and underestimate those that do. You only had to say one of those. All right, part 4. A large company has 500 stores in the United States and 300 in Europe. The average number of employees per store is 200 for a total of 100,000 employees in the US and 60,000 employees in Europe. The company considering offering employees one of two new benefits, one additional day paid vacation, or a small increase in pay. A survey will be given to a sample of employees to investigate which benefit is preferred and whether there is a difference in preference between employees in the US and Europe. Well, what we're checking out is to see whether or not the US and Europe are the same as far as their preference. And we have some stores that are in Europe and some stores that are in the US. Two sampling methods have been proposed. Sampling method 1, the company will randomly select 8 stores from its 800. All employees at the 8 selected stores will be asked which benefit they prefer. Okay, great, we know that. That's going to be a cluster. And why is that a cluster? We randomly selected a group and then we performed a census or surveyed all. So we know that this one, sampling method 1, is a cluster. And we'll get back to that in a moment when we get to the questions. Sampling method 2, the company will randomly select 1,000 employees from a list of all employees at the United States and 600 employees from a list of all employees at the European. So here we're broken down into 2 groups. So once you're broken into groups, it's either going to be stratified or cluster. In this case, broken down by US and Europe. And we randomly select employees from each group. So if we broke them down to a group and then randomly select, it's stratified. If we break them into groups, and survey all, randomly select a group and survey all, then it's cluster. So we have a cluster and we have a stratified. So then we get to the questions. One of the 2 methods resulted in a stratified sample of employees. Identify the strata and justify your response. So we have 9 points here that you can earn, and you have to identify the sampling method. You have to identify the strata, that's the second, and then you have to justify your response. So, and each part was worth 3 points. Sampling method 2 was the stratified, and why was it stratified? Because we broke it into 2 groups, US and Europe, and then went to each group and surveyed some from each group. Broke it into groups and surveying some from each group is stratified. So a stratified sample divides the population into groups based on a single characteristic and then randomly selects from the strata. There's my justification definition. And this is how it applies, because now I can contextualize it. In this case, the company divided the employees into 2 groups, strata based on US or Europe. The company then selected employees from both strata. All right, so I put it in context, which I always have to do. And the 2 strata are the US employees and European employees. So we had to have all of that in order to get the 9 points. If you had this part, you got 3 points. If you had this part, you got another 3 points. And then if you had the complete or correct justification, you received the other 3. Then it says identify the sampling method that results in a cluster of employees and identify the clusters, justify your response. Well, this is sampling method 1. So identifying a sampling method 1 as a cluster sample got you 3 points. And we know it's because they broke it into groups, they selected one of the stores, and then they surveyed all employees. All right. So we selected some of the stores, and then we surveyed all employees. Once you survey all in the group, that makes it a cluster. So again, we had to have the justification and named clusters. The clusters are the stores. Our justification: a cluster sample is a random sample. A cluster random sample selects a group or groups. In this case, we had 8 groups that were selected, and then performs a census by surveying everyone in the group. Sampling method 1 selects 8 stores and then surveys all the employees in those groups. Please remember, provide a definition, then provide context. If you had all 3 of those things, you got the 9 points. You have one statistical advantage and one statistical disadvantage of using sampling method 1 rather than sampling method 2. So in this case, we're saying, hey, what's the advantage of using a cluster versus a stratified and vice versa? Advantage: in sampling method 1, all job types and shifts are assured of being represented. Doesn't matter if you have all job types, that's fine of being represented because all employees in a store are surveyed, and that might not occur with method 2. Please note, when I'm making comparison, I have to compare to both. So I can't just say my advantage is, oh, we'd serve sampling method 1 surveys all job types. Well, that's great. We also have to say, and that might not occur with method 2. And the reason why method 2 is going to select from both countries, we're sure of that, but it may not get all job types. Disadvantage: it's possible that we might only have clusters from Europe or only have clusters from the United States, which would mean that we would not be representing one of the locations. Method 2 would ensure that both locations were represented. If we had both of those things, we got 9. If the advantage and disadvantage was correct, we got 9 points. If you had either one of them correct, you received 5 points. The next one: give a statistical advantage of using sampling method 2 rather than a simple random sample. Simple random sample is putting everyone in a hat and drawing. So if we use a simple random sample, it'd be possible to select all employees from Europe or from the United States and not represent the other location. By using sampling method 2, a stratified sample, we're sure of having representation from both locations. What we needed to see here is how the stratified method would be better, but we also had to mention the simple random sample, what could happen. You had to have both of those, what a stratified sample would do and what could happen if you had a simple random sample. If you had both of those things, you received the 9 points. One of the two got you 5 points. Finally, given one statistical advantage and one statistical disadvantage of using sampling method 2 rather than sampling method 1. Well, remember, this is my stratified and this is my cluster. Advantage: by using sampling method 2, which is stratified, we are assured of having representation from both Europe and from the US. All right, so we're assured of that by using sampling method 2. And then with sampling method 1, it's possible that we select countries from only clusters from only one country. So once again, I addressed both of them. This is what could happen with the stratified. This is what will happen with the stratified. This is what could happen with the cluster. Now we know the advantage of the stratified. Disadvantage: using sampling method 2, it's unlikely that we will survey every job type because we are taking a random sample of employees in a particular country. However, in sampling method 1, we perform a census of every employee and are assured of having all job types. Once again, I said, hey, stratified, we're going to be a random sample within the country, so we're sure to have the country represented, but not all employee types. With a cluster, we're not assured of having both countries represented, but we're assured of having every job type. If you had both the advantage and disadvantage correct, you received 9 points. One of those correct, received 5 points each. All right, hopefully that'll help you with the way you score these and give you more complete answers. And I know we're going to get better at these quizzes as time goes on. Thank you for watching. And this is your Stat Sensei, and I'll see you on the next one.